Well, Chris, it's great to see you. So welcome. So I would really like it if you could introduce yourself to our community and explain a little bit about where you're working now, what the core mission of your program is.
Hardin, great to see you again. It's been too long. I'm Chris Smith, Executive Director of Boston After School and Beyond, and we mobilize nearly 500 after school and summer programs who collectively serve over 25,000 kids in Boston to provide high quality, enriching, engaging programs. And the basis for that is that young people spend 80% of their waking hours outside of school. We don't often think about that, but the vast majority of a young person's time is spent outside of school. Yet so much of our focus in terms of public policy and consequently funding is focused on school, which is only 20% of the time. So we were founded back in 2005 on the idea that if we could fill those hours after school and the months during the summer productively, that we could really make a difference. And, I think this field was founded mostly on the need for childcare, which certainly hasn't gone away. It's very practical. And then on safety to keep kids out of harm's way. And we've been proud to be part of the evolution to how after school and summer programs not only provide needed childcare and safety, but really help kids learn and develop. And I think we in our field have grown coincident with some of the latest research on how development happens. And so it's been an incredibly fun journey working with really interesting, capable experts from so many different parts of the city to fill out this time outside of school.
Yeah. So before I'd love to hear a little bit how what you see is examples of how this works for people. But before we go there, I'd love to know what drew you to this work. What brought you into this work?
Yeah, I guess your answer in hindsight's always different. It's most likely different than what brought you into it in the first place. Coming out of college, I went to Trinity College in Hartford, and I always noticed it's evident the difference between the campus and the surrounding neighborhood. And I think anyone who's been in a campus like that gets disparity. And I would say my youthful idealism brought me toward the sector in general. And I like the interdisciplinary nature of it. I was an American Studies major. And so I spent, in addition to explaining to my parents, how sociology, political science, American literature fit together into a major, I thought, this type of work might be a way to put that into action. And to answer that question, what are you going to do with that degree? I started just volunteering on a congressional campaign in my hometown of Worcester, and getting exposed to some of the issues around then. And I remember reading Jonathan Kozol's Savage Inequalities. And it's unsettling when you think of a young person or two young people from different places who you think should have the same chances at success, but as we well know now, it's just not the case. So this field offered an opportunity to create different kinds of opportunities. And I started at the U.S. Department of Education back in the Secretary Riley's tenure. And there are a few people around there who were talking about learning outside of school. Very few, actually. Most of the focus was on teaching and learning in the classroom. But I was in a job where I got to work with different national nonprofits, faith-based leaders, businesses to talk about how they could play a role in education. That brought me to Boston, to the Private Industry Council, where I worked for a decade. And then ultimately to Boston After School and Beyond, which plays the same type of coordinating role, helping different players, in this case, mostly after school and summer programs, play to their strengths, but in a coordinated way where we can measure our collective progress together. And in doing so, really paint a picture of what learning could look like if it were holistic. So I think that was what drew me to it. My dad was a public administrator. He was a postal worker for most of his career, ended up as a postmaster. So I think the the public aspect was there. My mother volunteered through church a lot. So I think those things probably subconsciously came together.
It's a kind of a value structure.
The value structure, yeah, and interest. And but over time, I realized that it could be professionalized in all the ways we think of professionalizing work.
Yeah.
And so I've enjoyed bringing together what's disparate into coordinated approaches to developing measures to track our progress.
Yeah.
Against our goals.
You use the word twice, coordinated twice, and I'm really drawn to that word. And I'm going to, and you use this as a positive. This is part of bedrock to what you're saying. So what are the kind of the challenges to bringing, as you say, disparate partners together and creating frameworks in which they can feel, whether it's safe or encouraged or rewarded for collaboration and coordination?
Yeah, I think I'm guilty of this, but I think collaboration is among the most overused and ill-defined terms. You know, it likely shouldn't happen until it's necessary. I think a lot of it tends to be window dressing. In our case, I think the programs we organize have an interest in collaborating with us and one another because they're making themselves more visible in doing so. And as a result, are able to access the resources they need to operate. So there's real self-interest in collaboration. They can learn from one another, pick up tips. But it may not be for everyone. I mean, I think rationally, if you're an organization that can get by on your own, you don't need this data platform that we've created. You don't need collaboration. You don't need to present a strong collaborative hand to big public agencies like the Boston Public School, then you might be able to do it on your own.
Yeah.
And so what we've realized in having this network or collaboration, it gets stronger with each new member because you add a new perspective. Your data becomes stronger because you have more numbers, and you become stronger as a sector. You have more negotiating power. So the collaboration is really practical and helps all of us get better together.
You sort of, sometimes those of us who think of themselves as engaged in the progressive system change, starting with the framework of self-interest, sometimes ego dystonic. You know, we want to believe we're doing it for others, but you're suggesting or intimating that part of building a community is accepting and addressing people's self-interest and why should they be engaged? How does it serve them, even as we're thinking about serving kids? Is that a fair?
Yeah, and that's well said. I think in my own experience, you know, the first collaborative meeting always feels great. Look at all these people from different places. But it turns out we care about the same things. We have the same hopes. We have the same gripes. It's affirming. Yeah. And I love that too. But I'll never forget one of our program partners said, and this is back when I started, 2009. He said, "Chris, I love the company. I love the coffee and muffins at these meetings, but we need to start making progress on tangible things like fundraising." And that always stuck with me. And so I think actually our collaboration is more substantive now that we have data before us collectively, ideas for policy change, common challenges, particularly the past 2 years during the pandemic. It really put us to the test. What can we do together that we can't do alone? And what can we do together now without waiting for permission from someone else?
So how do you put together? So we talk a lot in this conversation. We talk a lot about caring, the ethic of caring. A lot of us come into the field because we have this belief that a nurturing, caring environment is the type of environment in which children can thrive and adults can thrive and flourish. How do you juxtapose that theory of caring with a acceptance that self-interest needs to be part of that? That once, you know, I have arguments or deep conversations with many people, and particularly one of my sons who questions this theory of altruism to the point that doubts people who don't own it first. So I'm wondering whether that's built in, that if we focus on caring, do we have to assume altruism as the driver versus, I have a self-interest in a positive community. So help me understand from your perspective, how do you work that dynamic?
That sounds like a great discussion for multiple conversations, not just this one, but I guess I think about it for myself. Caring is necessary, but not sufficient. A lot of people care.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you do about what you care about? And it's cliche because it's true. Actions speak louder than words.
Yeah.
And so we're looking to work with people who are willing to step up and show what they care about by what they do beyond their words and their expression that they care. But I think it has to start there. I mean, there are many ways to have a gratifying career. I assume that everyone who's in this does care. I actually assume that people who aren't in it also care, but maybe they express it in a different way.
Yeah.
And I do think people care more about it when they have skin in the game.
Yeah.
So
in terms of maintaining collaborations over time, what role does your acquisition and use of data play in facilitating the sustainability of your organization?
Yeah, we're a small intermediary, so we're fewer than a dozen people. We re-grant 2/3 of our funds, so we're very much light touch, and we exist only to enable those we mobilize.
Yeah.
So there's no earmark, there's no endowment. We could go away when we're not necessary. I'll tell you why we started.
I'm not sure I accept that last line. You go where you are necessary, but you're saying you don't have to have a significant investment in an infrastructure to be useful. Is that a fair correction?
Yeah, I would love don't get me wrong, I would love a significant investment in our infrastructure, but yeah, we've been relevant and viable, and therefore we exist. And the way we started, though, it was interesting. In 2008, we were deep in the high standards movement, and after school programs were saying, look, we're getting held accountable for grades and test scores.
Yeah.
It's hard enough to hold teachers accountable for that, and we're being held accountable for that. And we all recognize that was unfair, unscientific. But we quickly turned and said, well, what do you do, and what should you be held accountable for? And from that became really our reason for being. We came up with a set of skills that all these programs, despite their diversity, whether they're serving 5-year-olds or in-school, high school dropouts, or anyone in between, whether they're big, small, do arts or sports, they're all focused on some combination of thinking critically and problem solving, teamwork and social awareness, communication and perseverance. And they use their activity as a lens for learning. So once we understood that, we said, well, how many of you focus on these skills? 9 out of 10 focused on all of those. We asked, how many of you measure them? It was 2 or 3 out of 10. So we said, okay, maybe that's one way we can be useful, is develop a set of durable, portable measures across this diverse array of programs. And what we discovered is that once you get a lot of programs on that same platform, you can see relative strengths and weaknesses. As soon as you see differences, you can learn. And that's what fueled the collaboration, was learning from what we saw in the data. And now we're to the point where, as I mentioned, we're, in a given year, 25,000 students, almost 500 programs. You can glean real insights from the data. And it's become more of a community. So we first practically, necessity is the mother of all intervention. We went from hiring an evaluator to observe each site on a series of measures. And instead, we trained staff from each of the programs to observe one another. So every program benefits from a trained objective eye, and they build the capacity and the expertise in the evaluation tools. So that, I don't know, I used to feel this way. I'd get a test back and say, oh, I wish I had known the teacher wanted me to know that. But we train them on what they should know up front, so that they can incorporate it in their own programs. So data is just language that supports and facilitates a conversation, in this case about great youth development and the practices.
Can can you give an example of of how you measure, let's say, critical thinking or engagement across programs that's useful, what that looks like for those of us who are not in the measurement world? And that sounds like
Yeah.
I know people, when you talk about getting data and measurement, some people say you're trying to control me, you're not honoring, you're imposing an external framework on us. You're suggesting this is more evolved from the work of the participants. So what does that look like?
Yeah, we use mostly tools from the State Department of Elementary and Secondary Education that were developed by the National Institute on Out of School Time at Wellesley College. And I think the interesting thing to note is we complement an observer's perspective with that of students. So the trained observer looks at the structure and organization of the program. Do things move fluently? Are there good transitions in time? Is it well organized? Do kids know what they're focused on when they come in? To staff and student relationships, are they interacting in respectful ways? How stimulating the content is. Are they doing worksheets, or are they progressing through a set of skills? Those scores are complemented by a youth survey about the program too. And therein often lies interesting differences. I found the data has shown that kids are sometimes less generous than the observer. And so it's good to balance two perspectives. We do the same thing on skills. So we'll have program staff and teachers, depending on the program, observe the frequency with which young people in the program demonstrate those skills. So on, critical thinking, it might be, do they look for credible sources of information? They consider alternatives. Do they present clearly and persuasively in communication? Perseverance, do they come back after a setback? So they're all enumerated and scored. And again, young people are observed, and in many cases, they actually get the results so that they can have some feedback. By the way, it's all voluntary, so this isn't forced on anyone. Programs opt into it because otherwise they'd be left with very little to represent the great things they do. And in the few cases, and when we compare programs to one another anonymously, and somebody's got to be below average, and sometimes that's a tough pill to swallow. But what you see from these tools is they're very practical. So, I remember one time a program took a hit on the structure and organization. And we said, well, the person who's supposed to be greeting the kids had his back turned on his phone, and he only greeted every fifth kid. A better practice is to greet everyone by name. And they said, oh, that's fixable. So it gets to that level of granularity that you can actually do something about it. You don't have to hide from it or wonder what contributed to it.
Well, you just highlighted why I'm a big fan of criterion reference versus comparative data. So for us all to be above average, it may not be possible for all of us to be the same. So if you identify what the criteria is, and I'm advocating for this in around academic proficiency and competency, we get away from the gap should be between kids who are proficient and not proficient, not whether they're super able and struggling. And so we're reorganizing that, and that will allow measurement to be useful. Because if a gap between what I need to succeed is different than a gap between someone who has all the privileges and resources to do much better than I do. That's just a side note of one of my personal rants.
I agree with you. That's why we use a benchmark on them. Generally we're using 4 or 5 point scales. So we'll have a threshold, a benchmark, and on most indicators, we're between 80 or more % of the programs meet most of them, but there's always room for improvement. And these data turn quickly into very actionable words, so it's not alienating and easy to act upon.
One of the questions that we ponder a lot about is this another ambiguous word, character development, and it tends to take two different pieces. One, helping children develop their character, but also what is a caregiver? What are as a caregiver, when you hire people, look at people, or look at yourself, when you think of character traits or values that you think are useful and important in this work, what type of things come to your mind in terms of what good character looks like in your world?
I have 3 boys of my own, so we often have this discussion. And two things come to mind. I think just viscerally, I think of integrity and what you do when people aren't looking.
Yeah.
And that often is, what do you grind away at to get better? In some cases, you can think of hundreds of scenarios, but in terms of your skill development and what you bring to the table, whether you're in a program, on a team, in a classroom, leading a classroom, what are you doing to be a good participant in that? And most of that is underground. People don't see it. It's when everything's off. So I think of that as, character. Character gets used a lot in our work, though, in terms of skills. There are a lot of adjectives in front of skills. 21st century, soft, social, emotional, character. So I guess in that sense, we think of skills as malleable, and I've stopped using adjectives, but instead saying the skills, thinking critically, communicating clearly and persuasively, working well and contributing to teams and persevering. But, I think it's important for young people to know that you may have predispositions, you may have personality traits that you're born with. But with effort, you can change and adapt. And that's what our programs convey to kids, that you're not set in where you are. You're okay where you are, and we're going to help you to get to where you want to go. But I think viscerally, I think of character is what you do when nobody's looking.
Well, what do you bring, and what are the things that you end up owning? You may have a whole set of skills that are successful, help you be successful in the world. But then, kind of, as you said earlier, with your parents having provided a value structure of service, a belief in the public good, a willingness to spend your time driving improvement in communities, then how do you bring your skills to apply those values in a particular manner?
Yeah, and it comes to staff. People will often ask during the interview, what are you looking for? And I always say that your ability to anticipate what needs to be done, initiate it, and most importantly, follow through. And those sound really simple, but just doing that over and over again makes you really productive. And it sounds very basic, but sometimes it's hard to follow through, and you don't feel like it, and it requires a few extra calls and persistence. And I do think I think that's a sign of, it's work ethic, but it's also character, because especially in our world, you're not doing it for yourself or the organization. You're doing it on behalf of a larger effort.
So if you were talking to that junior at Trinity who's has chosen the MCiv major, American Studies major. Sorry, I gave my college was American Civ. It's an American Studies major, and they were looking and come for that information interview. What would you want them to know that you wish you had known when you started out?
I think that, knowing you wonder, who am I? Where am I going? How am I going to succeed? And especially in your early 20s, how do I get from that entry level to the next step? To know that experience is probably more valuable than anything else, and a better teacher. So I'd want that person to be open to doing whatever is necessary within the organization to get things done. And even if there's not a direct payoff in responsibility, you accumulate reference points, so that when you experience something challenging later on, you remember what it felt like, both your successes and failures. I remember them a lot. I mean, I draw on my own experiences from out of school programs and work. And when things went really poorly, to know that, all right, I endured that. I'm still here. Mistakes are okay. Just get back on the horse and keep going. But I think the value of a diverse set of experiences, don't get locked into an expertise too quickly.
Other participants in the podcast have suggested that they wish they had been more comfortable with taking more risks when they were younger, They were so worried about not making a mistake, and now they found they learned so much from the mistakes they made, that if they'd taken a little more risk, a little more confidence to kind of try something they weren't sure about, or stick by their perspective that may not be successful, that's where real learning and growth has come in their life. So it sounds similar to your suggesting, engage, step out, take the risk, do something to learn from it, not just apply what you already know. That's the risky, scary thing for many of us when we're in our late 20s.
Yeah, it's when you're at that moment before you take the risk, you're likely weighing the outcome of it working out or not. But I agree, just if you go for it early, you're also afforded more slack if you go for it early.
Yes.
So there's no doubt that can pay off. And as you say, failures are probably better teachers than successes, because it jolts you into thinking and reflecting about, why didn't that work? What could I have done differently?
Yeah.
And the other thing is, you can't control the world around you. You may wish things were different, maybe even that your employer is different. You can only control yourself in that context. So I would say, as you take risks, keep that in mind. I think that self-reflection and ownership from an early age, however it turns out, it's really an important character trait as well.
Yeah.
And value to adhere to. I mean, I think those people are the most impressive when you reflect on that, however it went, they say, here's what I did, here's what I could do differently, rather than projecting what else could have happened.
Well, Chris, I really want to thank you for the time, but also more importantly, what you do for the kids of Boston. But even more so, what I really admire about your work, what you do with such grace and kindness, is bringing adults together to feel a sense of community and shared focus on our children. Very rare, increasingly rare in this world, and takes a lot of patience. And I really want to say that how much I admire the work you do, and how important that building adult relationships and networks is for our children. And I want to thank you for that. But before I let you go, I want you to share 3 things. I'm stealing this from Ezra Klein's podcast. So he asked for 3 books. So I'm gonna more open than that. What are 3 podcasts, books, articles, experiences that you would recommend people have? Recommend for people who are working in this world, creating communities in which kids can thrive?
Yeah, thank you. And before I do, Hardin, I want to thank you, because you've been a part of driving that collaboration, as a member of the Boston School Committee and Dean of Education. It was, you were uniquely positioned in some ways to tout the benefits of learning outside of school. And you hosted 2 of our bigger events in back when we were in person, which really helped facilitate and galvanize this community. So I want you to know that too.
Oh, great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think in terms of experiences or books, I mean, I do think Savage Inequalities holds up, because it gets at what's structural about inequality in a very specific way. And I think for anyone interested in education or anything related to education, that's totally worthwhile. I think doing something experientially, especially as you get older, that you've never done, can really shock you into the learning mode. I boxed in with the boxing program in our class, in our network last year. I'd never done that. I'd never put on gloves. And it was eye-opening to see the young person's perspective, get to know the teacher, and to realize that program is really nothing about boxing and everything to do with skill, persistence, practice. So I would say I plan to build more of that into my routine. And I would say, in terms of podcasts and media consumption, I've been more deliberate about consuming issues from the other perspective. So I think for a while I probably fed my own perspective, and it feels good to reaffirm things, but I've been trying to challenge myself and read more from both sides. And,
Yeah.
and I found it more interesting. I'm more engaged, and I think I'm more knowledgeable as a result. So I think those are the three things I'd advise.
Can you give an example? While you think about that, I've been encouraged. I'm about to take a 14-hour drive by myself this Friday. So I've downloaded Thomas Sowell's new book, and explicitly recommended to me from a friend who says, you dismiss this guy a lot. I want you to sit and listen to him, and then figure out what's going on. So that's my example of trying to do that. So what would you recommend for those of us who we all are deep in our feeds and we start listening to something? And do you have any suggestions for those of us who may be overly invested in our own echo chamber?
Well, I don't want to betray any of my own alliance by my predispositions, but I would just say that I've grown tired of the cheap shots, especially in people I believe in. So if I hear something where they're taking cheap shots, I feel like that's falling on one side of the divide in a gratuitous way. Hey, sometimes that's fun, but I would say there are a lot of serious podcasts out there that would make you think. You know what I aspire to, though, in terms of perspective? I mean, I know, the Economist, for those who can keep up with it, and I confess that I can't. They have, it's an economically liberal and actually socially liberal perspective, and it has an economic point of view for sure.
Yeah.
But I find its coverage tends to walk the line a bit, in a way that some other publications don't. And so I look for that level of apparent neutrality when I'm listening to.
Yeah. Great example.
But I've gone back to music now, Hardin, as a perspective, and trying to read more. And the great, I remember a teacher saying, he said, education becomes valuable when suddenly you realize that two concepts you've studied independently come together, and that ignites a fire for learning. And I said, well, we'll see when that happens. But that's so true. And the same when you read, I mean, especially something written a while ago, and you realize the same phenomenon exists now. And, that author put into words what you could only think and feel, and she or he has articulated. And so that's such a great feeling. So that, I think music does the same thing. So
now you have to give us an example before I let you go. Got to give us a music example. This is like, I don't know if you know Ken Elmore, the dean of students here at BU. Now he's taken over the presidency of Dean College. His music was a great way that he talks about.
Yeah, it's a good way to relate. I just brought my 16-year-old son. We were going to a lacrosse tournament, and we stopped at NYU, and we took turns playing songs the whole way down. So I would say just fun and conscientious. Tribe Called Quest, we both like that.
Okay.
I think Dylan has timeless lyrics. And of course, Bruce behind me, I think, is probably he's up there for me. So I never get sick of them. But through my son, I was learning about some new artists too, and different way of expressing similar and different ideas. It's a lot of fun, and it generates a lot of conversation that you wouldn't otherwise have. And I look back, as an American Studies major, those are some of my favorite courses. We did a lot on music. Early protest music of Black American women. I mean, it's such a cool way to look at society, politics, culture, and change over time. That I'd love to incorporate more of that into our work. It's just a way to enhance it and make it even more fun.
Well, Chris, once again, thank you so much for your time, and for all that you do for children, and such a great national model. We know that you help us create a world in which kids examples of how kids can flourish better. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Hardin. Great to see you.